Hi, I'm Annette and welcome to my presentation, In-Place Migrations with Plone Feels Like Magic. Now, slight disclaimer, it's not easy and it takes some strategy, but honestly, when everything is worked out, it feels like magic. A little bit about myself again. I'm Annette. I'm a senior Python developer at 6 Feet Up, and I've been working with Plone for over 8 years at this point. I did not come into the tech world expecting to be a developer. It was always a hobby, but I guess fun things and habits die hard. I just kept doing it, and I switched into a professional career path, and I've been loving working with it ever since. So getting started with the whole thing, the project scope. I think that's probably the most important thing when you're ever going into a migration is, what am I trying to do? What is my starting point? And in this case, we were working with Plone 5.1 in Python 2.7, which was previously migrated from Plone 4. And that note was really important to me because knowing the long story of the site can really help you with forecasting and working on things and problems as you're going through. And since it was migrated from Plone 4, we had already migrated a lot of like the archetypes to dexterity and such. So I knew that was something to keep in the back of my head. It also meant this was a mature site with a long history, and I had to make sure I accounted for that when we were going through this migration process. Now, this site was relatively small in the number of add-ons. It had 18 add-ons, so not a ton, but enough that we had to be aware of that. And some of them were custom forks. So this was forked from the original code that they were maintaining on the side. They also had custom content workflows with fine-tuned existing content, and many users with local users and permissions and roles already set up. So once again, we were working with a mature site that's already been configured and fine-tuned to work for the client that we were working with. And that was really going to inform the choices we were making afterwards. But going into client requirements, since we were working on this on behalf of our client, we wanted to get and capture their goals and what they were trying to do with this. So we knew the big picture. We wanted to move from Plone 5.1 to Plone 5.2 on Python 3. We wanted to be up to date, current. We wanted all of the security benefits and any of the benefits that come with upgrading the system in terms of new features and functionalities that was available to them. We knew we wanted to keep their existing content. We definitely wanted to maintain their site settings as it was a mature site, and we wanted to maintain the custom workflows there. Now that also included maintaining site-wide and local user permissions because we had placeful permissions in place. We wanted to make sure those were preserved with the content, and we wanted to maintain as much add-on functionality as possible. But then the big new thing was implementing the new design and the theme that was happening. So our goals, and this is like the internal set of goals for our team working on this, is we wanted to make a process that was repeatable, reliable, and that if anybody else in the team stepped in, they could run this and succeed. And a lot of that means not laying out landmines for your coworkers by nudging the process along here and there. That secret, most of this worked, but I just had to tweak this one knob to get this to go. We wanted to be much more reliable on that. And to do that, we shifted to like a complete programmatic approach. Anything that could be done programmatically was done that way. And that makes your day of checklist when it's time to actually do the migration for real much simpler. Now, we wanted to make sure that we were going to implement the theme and some template updates to work with the existing content as well. And once again, we're avoiding any manual configurations that we can, so we can keep this nice and repeatable. So all of that, before we get into planning and like putting everything down on paper, we want to kind of choose which migration method we're going to go with. So my title is kind of a spoiler on the way we went, but just kind of some of the thought process going into which process we were choosing going along with that. We wanted to, think about the current site and the client requirements. And there's basically two migration paths. There's the in-place migration, which is the traditional Plone story. It maintains the current content. It's mature. It's been used for a long time. It's quite reliable. But once again, it's a little more error prone because it is complex and comprehensive. It does a lot. So if you've got baggage you've carried over, it's like when you move a house. If you just shove everything into the box, eventually you're going to lose track of what you actually have with you. So you might have to go through and figure out, oh, this might cause a problem. I don't actually need this. And you're carrying that cruft along. Whereas with your content export import method, there's several add-ons and paths available to you. So there's like collective JSONify, which is often used with transmogrifier. Now that does take some configuration, and transmogrifier can look really intimidating when you're looking at it for the first time and thinking about trying to build pipelines and such. Now, fortunately, there's great trainings on it on the Plone training site. So that's always a resource. And then there's also like the collective export import, collective.import export, which is a new slick interface. I haven't gotten to use it yet, but I've seen it used in several demonstrations and it looks great. It looks like a great way for someone who might not be as experienced or a developer technical to start migrating content, and then you can tweak it to do more. But that gives you a cleaner migration because you're just migrating your content. But at the same time, it means you're going to need to reapply a bit of your customizations and configuration. So if you have a really complex site and you really don't want to touch some of the infrastructure that's there in the way that's put together, that could be really scary as well, trying to replicate it. But it also can give you a nice clean slate if you just need the content, if you want to reorganize and kind of rebuild from scratch. So for us, the in-place migration was definitely going to be the way that we were going to go. So now we've got our migration thought process. We can actually start planning some of this, laying out the basic framework of what we're going to do. And that was going to allow us to make our timelines, set our expectations, and especially working in a team setting, because this is not something I did all on my own. It's going to allow us to divvy up the work to be done and make sure that we don't trip over each other. So here's our very high level overview. We're moving from Plone 5.1 on Python 2 to Plone 5.2 on Python 3. And you know, just saying that out loud simply, it feels like it's a fairly simple, straightforward process, but we need to break that down a little bit more to get a clearer picture. And essentially, we kind of have to predict some of the things that we can go through here. So breaking it down to a slightly less high level overview, what we really need to do is go from Python 2, Plone 5.1 to an intermediate. We want to upgrade to Plone 5.2 on Python 2, and then convert our database to Python 3 and do whatever work needs to be done over that. And like the Plone documentation actually has some great steps on, you know, trying to think about this process and moving yourself through it. And I did definitely use that as a reference. The docs are an invaluable resource when doing anything, especially even if you've done it a couple of times. It helps to go back and just refresh yourself or see if anything has been updated there. So that was what we're going to do. Take our site, get it to the most recent version on Python 2, get the conversion, and then do what we needed to do afterwards. So now this is when you're going to ask yourself some of those planning questions. We're going to try and peer into our crystal ball and forecast the things that we need to be aware of to sketch out and outline the process. So some questions that are always great to ask: what add-ons are there and are they available in Python 3? Make an inventory, make a list, document that. You want to also think about, is any of your content or add-ons related to archetypes? Even though this site had been migrated previously, we had to make sure that nothing was relying on archetypes, because that is not available on Python 3 and it will break your site in quite catastrophic ways at times. So we really want to clean that up and get rid of that kind of stuff. So we're on a clean slate with that part. We also want to think, are any of the add-ons that we currently have integrated into core? The developers of Plone have been really great about putting in features of things that we use often into core. And like a good example about that is like the web courtier drop-down menus. Well, Plone 5.2 has the drop-down menus built in, so we might not need that plugin anymore. So we can uninstall that and leave that in the past. Another thing is like the Plone redirection tool. Plone core now has those aliases built into it, so we don't need that product. In fact, the Plone upgrade actually migrates those over quite nicely. So we can start getting rid of some of those things that are integrated into core already and just have a little bit of a lighter load going forward. And that way we can just document what's available in Python 3, what already has a migration story. For example, like Plone form gen relies on archetypes. So we knew we had to migrate that. And since then, EasyForm actually has a great migrator already built into it. So we were able to just tap into that process in our upgrade steps and have that migration done, and then leave that behind as well. So it's just about cleaning stuff up and trying to figure out what do I need to do. And then the last thing is really, when you're going through this, do any configurations need updating after migrations? Have any settings changed? Do they no longer exist? Have the name of checkboxes changed? And just kind of keeping an eye on that and making sure that at the end of the line, we replicate or recreate those settings so that we can do that constantly and have the same type of performance at the end. So now after asking all of those questions, I can now say, okay, this is my actual migration path outline. So what we ended up doing for this project is organizing the steps into different branches. And that way we could check out a branch, run build out, and then we would do the upgrade steps and it would programmatically go through and do that set of work for us. Then we could check out the next step and programmatically go through. So here on my little road, curvy swervy road here, I have like my base starting point, which is our production branch. Then we ended up making a pre-upgrade branch, which had pre-upgrade steps. So that's where we did things like migrate away from Plone form gen. That's where we uninstalled old add-ons that we weren't using or deleted content that we weren't going to bring over or such anymore. Just getting a nice clean slate at the 5.1 step where it was easy for us to repeat it and test it against production data to make sure that it was going to work before moving on. Then we checked out our Plone 5.2 branch and actually ran that upgrade. And that was a pretty easy one where all we had to do is like remove archetypes, run the built-in Plone migration, and just tweak a couple things on the other side. Then we have our convert the database step. There's a command, like a single line command for basically doing that step. And then after all of that is done, we're on Python 3, 5.2. We just have to do our post-migration steps to clean up everything and make sure this is the state of the system we want at the end. So that's like our outline of the entire path. And this next slide is just kind of a text representation. So when we were posted these online, you can look at the text and have an idea of what I was saying without the swervy word. So now preparing the site data, and that's actually starting to look into the bones of what we were trying to do in that pre-upgrade step. And I dare say the pre-upgrade step was actually one of the most important parts of just getting and refining this process and making sure that all our data was going to be in a good state for the migration process. Now, first step, and everyone kind of does this a little bit differently. One of my favorite first steps when we're trying to do a migration is look ahead to the end goal. And that's like for any project I do. So in this case, you want to kind of forecast your migration steps. And it's hard to peer in a crystal ball and say this, and this is going to be a problem. We can make pretty good guesses, but sometimes things hit us that we're not expecting, especially if your code base is a mature, older code base. So one thing that's really great to do is just take your current code as it is, make a copy of it, check it out, clear out all the data, upgrade it, like just run it on Python 3, upgrade it to 5.2, and just try and get it running with no data in it. At that point, you're going to start eliminating some of those third-party add-ons that don't work, that haven't been migrated to Python 3. And if you have any custom code or add-ons, strange monkey patches stuff in your code, this is also that time when those will start to be telltale signs of, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that. And then document everything. I'm a writer and I'm a note taker, but when you're working on a project, it's so much easier to just say, here's my list of things that I couldn't do. And then that way you can refer to that list later and say, okay, when I'm working through the upgrade process, these are the things we need to make sure are accounted for and we make decisions about. But the goal is just to get a working instance using that code base as a base on Python 3. and then noting the differences of what you need to do from there. Now that I have an idea of what I'm going to have to change, I'm going to go back to my pre-upgrade branch and start preparing that data for that first step. So one of the things that I ended up doing was disable those noisy items, such as content rules and cache purging. Because when you're just testing and running through things, if I know I'm going to be deleting an entire content section because we no longer need it, it might be really alarming for the client to get a slew of emails that all of this stuff was deleted, especially because this site is separate from the production site. So I disable the noisy things. And once again, because I'm disabling this noisy thing, that's going to go in my documentation checklist. In fact, it's really handy that in that first step, you prepared that Python 3 branch, because you can go right into your upgrade steps and stub out a new function as a step and put a comment and say, re-enable caching, re-enable content rules, re-enable your stuff. So even if you haven't gotten that far yet, you've got a note of things that you've got to do, and you can save that and commit that. And that way, when you get to the end, you'll remember to do those things again. This one actually caught me off guard. Ensure your catalog is up to date. I will go into this story a bit more later in my lesson learned, but important. You want to make sure that this stuff is working, that your site is aware of everything that's in it, especially since as you're upgrading, Plone is going to operate a lot of times against what's in the catalog. And if it's not in the catalog, it's not going to be operated against, which means it's going to get missed. So we're going to delete content that we're not migrating. And like, I just do it straight from this early step. Just get rid of it early. Don't leave it till later and then get rid of it. Get rid of it early, and remember the portlets. That one got me. We got all the way to the end and there was like a portlet that it wasn't even visible. So there's some scripts that you can write or scripts that you can get to just inventory things. I think it's really good if you can just say, list all the portlets on this site. So you can get a list and say, oh, I didn't know that this one page had a portlet. We need to delete this. Or, oh, I didn't know we were relying on this here. Do we need that functionality? I did similar things with the Plone API. It's really easy for like getting an inventory of how many forms did I have with Plone Form Gen. And that way, before I started, I could just say, this is how many forms I have now. This is how many forms I had then. If those numbers weren't even, it meant something got lost in the shuffle and I need to find out why. That's a step I need to investigate and find out something happened. Why is that not working? Once you've got an inventory and you've gotten rid of the stuff you don't need, that's a good time then to start migrating away from your archetypes content. Like I said, Plone Form Gen to Easy Form, in this case, was the only one we had to deal with because it had already been migrated from 4 to 5. And then once you've gotten rid of all the content and all the ghosts of the past and all that stuff you don't need, then uninstall your add-ons. So once you've uninstalled your add-ons, this is a great time to go click through your site. If a page doesn't load, it probably means you missed something related to that add-on. Click through, take a look, just a quick survey. If you happen to know which pages are hit the most, go ahead and visit those pages. Make sure that it kind of at least works somewhat. We know we're going to be fixing stuff down the line, but we want to make sure the base functionality of the site is still solid before we get too far and realize we need to come all the way back. So now we've cleaned up everything. We checked out our pre-upgrade branch. It's time to actually move towards 5.2. So at this point, this is the last place on Python 2 that we can have archetypes. So like we actually had installed products archetypes just to make sure if there was anything that was using it, we would have the code to be able to remove it. And that's something that can be easy to forget, is that if you're trying to uninstall something, you often at least need to reference or import the class or the object you're trying to get rid of to be able to remove it correctly. So we installed that just so we could say, okay, we want to make sure we get every archetypes tool that we know exists possibly. We want to make sure that we get the old interfaces that are there. We want to clean out all of that evidence. And what's nice is once you have these steps in place, if you get to the end and you realize, oops, I missed that, we could add that to that upgrade step. So I had one upgrade step that was just called remove old interfaces. And every time I found something that I missed, I'd go back and add that into that step and add it into the step. And that way I could just kind of build that up and refine that as I was going through. And then I did talk about those interfaces, definitely. It's amazing how until you turn something off, you really don't realize what was standing on it. It's kind of like, we all, not quite the best analogy, but like if you have a table and you just kick out a leg, it's going to fall over most times, but you wouldn't know until you took it out that it was a problem. So that's kind of what we do here, is turn it off, see if it works, and then whatever is complaining, if we don't need it, remove it. And then once we've cleared out archetypes, now we're going to run that Plone upgrade. And that one was actually pretty easy. You can just literally just run like the Plone upgrade migration step, and it does a whole bunch of magical stuff. It's honestly, it's so magical. It takes a little while, but it cleans up things, it reindexes things. It got rid of problems that I had seen before. It just cleared up everything. So I loved it. Just like, oh, that's lovely. No pipelines, no, just do the thing. So now that Plone took care of that part for me, I had to go to migrating the database. Now this is actually nicely documented. Here we ended up working with Postgres, so it's a little bit different. And I did gloss over some steps that you would normally do, like the ZODB verify. And I will talk about that here because it's important. If you're working with like a data.fs file, the ZODB verify is an indispensable tool. It will walk over your objects in Plone and it will tell you which classes are missing. And even if you don't act on them right away, that is going to be your list of things to investigate when you get to the end of the line that are problems. And then you can fix them and then rerun your migration. So even though our production system that we were working with was in Postgres, we had actually exported a data.fs to our local environments. And I made sure I ran the ZODB verify against that. That way I could make that list, look at things that might be problems, and then make sure that I put in some code steps in my pre-upgrade branch to fix those problems so that they wouldn't be a problem down the line. So then after that, the steps are fairly simple. You pack your database to 0 days. You want to make sure you get rid of a lot of those objects so you're not carrying up that cruft again. You're going to set up your Python 3 build out that we already prepared in the first step. We want to move the installed parts and the eggs and stuff that might conflict or tell Plone, oh, I already have that. I don't need that. And then since it was Postgres, I had to make a migration configuration. So I just had a step for that. So I just ran build out to install just that part of the code. And then I have that migration step kind of just listed there, but that's the command you essentially use to run the conversion. So this is the Postgres version. If you were using a data.fs, you would put like the path to your database, but then Plone takes care of all the rest of that for you. That's the whole conversion step. So once I cleaned up my data, prepared it, made sure I had everything I needed, like just a good clean step, the actual migration process for me wasn't bad. Most of it just came down to debugging problems and cleaning up stuff. So into refining the migration steps, and this is basically comes down to working through challenges. The process itself is simple, but if you have old code or old add-ons, you need to make sure that those are prepared for the migration. So the biggest thing is know your tools. The PDB debugger is invaluable. And what I would do is I would trim my content down. So I just wrote a little script to say, let's get rid of 1/2 of the stuff that's in here if it's a big site, or let's just keep 1/3. And then you want to run some of your migration steps on just that data. And then if you have a problem, you can jump into the debugger and investigate that. And I was able to find out when I had like an interface, something that came up kind of frequently is like V not in sequence. And at that point, I knew that that was probably a class or an interface that a piece of content had that no longer existed. And then I could at least go through PDB, go up the trace stack and find out what sequence was it upset about? What object was it upset about? And at that point, I could save that piece of text. And if I wasn't familiar with it, I could go to collective migration helpers. So if you've never heard of this repo, it is a invaluable resource. It's essentially a repo with just kind of cut and paste snippets of migration steps or codes or upgrade scripts or functions that people have used over time. And it's kind of even organized. Like there's a like Archetypes one, and there's like a portlets area. So you can go in and say, okay, this is a particular class that I had a problem with. Let me look up migration helpers and see if someone has a piece of snippet or code on how to fix that or upgrade that or migrate that. So I was using that. It's, like I said, it's an invaluable resource. It's really great. And especially if you ever come up with a script or a snippet that's helpful, definitely contribute back to that, because collectively we all help each other by keeping that up to date. And then once again, ZODV verify, which is really great for just getting a big list of all your potential problems, anything that's missing, anything that you're probably going to either need to delete or install something to fix later. So here I have just kind of like a little snippet of like one of the codes that I would use here. And this is my remove old interfaces. And running into this one was a surprise. This was one of those where you think everything's fine, you get to the end, the site works, you're clicking through things, and you find that one file that just won't load. And I got that, like the V in sequence is not working. So it couldn't open whatever it was trying to open. So I used the PDB debug, I crawled up through the ranks and I saw, why in the world do I have an AT blob anything? AT is archetypes. That means something's not right. And after some Googling and going through the community forums and such, I realized that even though these items were dexterity, which is the newer Plone content type, somehow in that migration process from 4 to 5, these interfaces were still available on these content items. So when Python 3 tried to load it, none of them existed because I got rid of archetypes. That was the whole point. But it was trying to reference these interfaces. So then I had to write like a nice, cool little script and just say, okay, these are the list of things that I need to remove. And then once again, I'm going through the brains of the catalog, iterating through it. And I'm saying, if you find this, go ahead and get rid of this. So this was a great example of me having to go back to that pre-upgrade branch. Or in this case, I think I did this on 5.2 because that was right before I uninstalled Archetypes, and removing all of this stuff. And then what I would do is once I remove this, I would uninstall that product I had added, the Archetypes, just to kind of support things, go to those content items and make sure it worked. But like this was the kind of thing that it was the file images, I couldn't open the folder contents, I couldn't open any of the pages these images were on. I was completely locked out from the front end at looking at this content because of this interface. And being able to go through PDB debug really helped. And if you've ever seen it, I know Phil Bauer has like this tutorial on going through debugging with Python. It is excellent. It is a great primer for kind of learning to get your feet wet. And even if you know how, he showed people stuff that we just had never heard before that were right there. So it's a great way to kind of get in and dig in, and it will help you debug or find any problems. And like this is another one. This one actually is a snippet basically straight from collective migration helpers on just removing archetypes. And these are all tools that are in Plone. If you ever go into the ZMI, you can see them listed that need to get removed. And if you're not an expert at Plone or don't know all the things that need to come out, this could be helpful for saying, okay, these are the things I need to remove in this function. And then you can read through the code in migration helpers and adjust it based on what you have available to clean up the tools that you have. So those were just some examples of some of the kinds of stuff I went through to prep data. So now kind of going into my lessons learned from this whole process. Test everything. This is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 probably in this process. When you get to the end, when you're going through, test everything. Errors pop up in the least likely of places. So a story about this is I was talking about those interfaces, the AT blob image and file. We were like 3 weeks into user acceptance changing. Everything was dandy. Everything was nice. All the pages were loading. Everything felt just about fine. And then someone tried to delete a user and we ran into the type error, the extensions type error, which usually means, we missed a class. Something has an old class on it. So I was able to replicate the problem. PDB went in and I saw it was that AT blob image. And I said, why in the world would deleting a user hit an AT blob image? That doesn't make sense. And by then I had already written my script to clean up all that stuff. So I was just like, that makes no sense. I tested everything that logically made sense for what could have gone wrong, but I had not tested everything at that point. Well, it turns out that we had a swath of images that had not been cataloged in the Plone catalog. So even though my script did due diligence, it wasn't in the catalog, so I never cleaned it up because it wasn't there. And it was just the most unlikely places. I guess when you delete a user, it takes their information out of all the content, it walks through all the files, and it just happened to hit that image. But that was a good example of test everything, and we found something that could have been a problem, like a sleeping silent problem down the line that we didn't even know was coming at us. So now one of my steps that I think I'm going to add to any migration I do in the pre-upgrade or first steps is just reindex the whole catalog. It'll take a while, but at least at that point, I'll know what I'm working with, especially if you're working with the Plone API, will be true and complete at that point. Take snapshots. Migrating is still a lengthy process. Like I said, it's not necessarily easy in that you have to like make some strategy to get through it. But once you've figured that out, the day of process was very simple for me. It was something that I could run over and over again. The only thing that was stopping me was the amount of time it was going to take. But in your local environment, you don't want to spend hours migrating your stuff every time, especially if you have heavy functions like migrating the forms. We had over 100 forms, probably closer to 200 forms in that site. That took a while. So I trimmed down my content, but I saved a version of my data FS with just everything. Then I saved the version with the trim content, and I organized these into folders. Then once I ran all the migration steps, I had a folder that was post-migration pre-upgrade. And then once I upgraded to 5.2, I had a folder that was post-migration 5.2. And then once I got to Python 3, I had a post-migration 5.3. And this was really invaluable working through the process, because if I found like I got to the end of Python 3 and said, I have a step that needs to go between pre-upgrade and 5.2, I could open that post pre-upgrade and just run through that sequence of the steps only. And that allows me to make more repeatable steps, or allows me to debug or dig in or try and find errors from just that point, and then make informed decisions on where in my upgrade process I need to make that kind of step. Saved me a lot of time and just made it more easy for me to repeatedly try things and repeatedly make sure that I could do it several times. So like once I figured it out, I would run that step just a couple of times to make sure, okay, this is solid now. I can move on to the next part. And then eventually I'd run the whole thing through again. Know your site history, especially if you have an in-place migration, because everything gets brought along. Very, very old sites honestly may benefit from a clean slate. So if you or your client's in the place where they say, you know what, maybe we'd like a clean slate. We don't want everything that came along with us. That's a great opportunity to say, I'm just going to clean up stuff. We're just going to bring the content. We're going to set everything up fresh. And that way you don't have to worry about that. But since we wanted to keep that, we needed to know enough about the site to even do some informed debugging. So like just knowing that this had been migrated from Plone 4, I already knew that, okay, Archetypes was in here at some point. So it wasn't impossible to see content types had archetype interfaces on them still. And then once that popped up, it made sense. And I said, okay, This just happened to be a piece of craft that snuck through and was working till now. Now I can remove it properly. And then probably the biggest one, I've said it several times by now, document your work. Like really document your work. It's going to help you make informed decisions. Both of these do, all of them do, quite frankly. But we want to make sure that we know what we did. And in a project like this, I would document the successes and the failures. So as I was refining my migration steps, and I said, okay, this branch works, this was fine, I did this step to clean this up, I did this step to clean that up. I would keep a list of that. And putting comments in your upgrade steps is super helpful, because when you read through your code, you can just say, oh, this one says it removes things that we're not using anymore. This one says it's going to clean up this step. And another thing that you can do that's kind of like a form of documentation is use your logger. When you're doing an upgrade step, don't just let the build out run silently and do those upgrades. Log that in thing. So you can say, okay, I am now migrating these forms. I am migrating these forms, and that will happen. I am removing these interfaces. It's helpful to just keep a count of what you're doing. So I would always account and say, okay, I removed 200 items of interfaces, because that also tells me there was a lot more in here than I ever thought that needed to be cleaned up. And that will make me either more aware moving forward and saying there was a lot here, or say, oh, there really wasn't anything that I needed to fix here. It came up to 0 or 1. It's very minor, and help me decide at what point I need to do things. And if nothing else, it helps, especially if you're working on a team, for people to come in and say, oh, you know, I've worked on this before. I saw this here before. I can give you my documentation, or for me to pass it forward. And especially with a long project, it helps you to say, well, you know, we finished this work and we were in user acceptance changing for a month. Let me just take a look at what I was doing and see why I did this way over that way. Because when you move to a different project, it can be hard to just instantly come back with all of the things you were doing before. So I document all of my things. So these are, again, some of extra resources that I highly recommend. The Plone Docs upgrade guide is really great for doing this migration. It's super helpful. Migration Helpers is invaluable for finding examples, especially if you're not experienced, or even if you run into something you're not familiar with. It's a good place to get ideas and even see some of like the best practices on how to do things. And when all of that fails, the community forums, the Plone forums are great. They're very helpful. And it might not even be you asking a question. Someone else probably has been there before you, and you can look that up and say, okay, someone else did this. Let's see how they solved it. And if you do need to ask a question, you know, make a nice informed question. This is where that documentation can come in handy. You can detail some of the steps that you went through and some of the things that you did or didn't do. And then that can help them help you. And I try and make it a habit, if someone in the forum can't provide me an answer, but I happen to be able to come up with an answer, I go back to the forums and I say, hey, you know, I figured this out and this is how I was able to do it. So that way somebody later on can come back and say, oh, this person asked that question, how'd they solve it? And at least they'll see my answer on how I got around it. And sometimes that works both ways. You can say, you know, I never fixed this as it was, I had to use a workaround. But at least that person knows that you didn't just give up, you found another way to work around it or do something about it to get to that point. Right, so thank you for coming along with me. I hope it was a good experience. I know I didn't get into the technical code, and that's because a lot of that becomes quite personal with how you go through the content. But what I really wanted to describe more than anything is the mindset and the thinking. And it may seem like it is a huge hill to climb, but just breaking things down, taking snapshots, working small, using your resources. And then once you get it, honestly, it was an undertaking for me. I was terrified in the beginning. It was this huge wall in front of me and I didn't know which way to go. But I was able to just breathe, use my tools, And when I got to the end, it honestly, it feels like magic. I'm amazed that it was able to happen. And I have to be thankful to the Plone community and my forefathers who set down the processes they have, that the only thing I honestly had to handle was my code and just my configuration, because Plone took care of itself in this process. Thank you.